talking to us. Where were you born?
I was actually born in North Sydney.
And well, where did you grow up?
I spent my younger years up to about 7 in Surrey Street in King's Cross, or Darlinghurst as it was then, or as it is now, I suppose. But it's only 5 minutes from the centre of King's Cross. And then we moved to an upgrade to Paddington, but it was before the social uplift. It was very much a working man's suburb. So, but still we moved, and it was next to the Scottish Hospital, and we were surrounded, or at least in front of us we had trees and never be built out, and could see the harbour from the top. So it was a lovely spot, and I can understand now why so many people really want to live there. Because everything was close to the sea, it was close to the city, it had a beautiful climate, and all those features which until recently I don't think were fully recognised, but we appreciated. And it was a quiet area. I used to play cricket in the street. There weren't all the cars whizzing up and down as there are now. So when I go back there and look at Brown Street in Paddington, it's very difficult to reconcile it with the same type of quiet area that I knew. I always wanted the horse to put in the front, but my parents drew the line there.
Well, what year were you born?
In 1939.
So what would be your earliest memories?
My earliest memories, coming home from school. I used to walk through King's Cross each day to come home from school.
Stop. You were talking about your earliest memories?
Well, I suppose one of my earliest memories was coming home through King's Cross from school. I went to school at Potts Point, I think, just when I was 3. And my sister, who was 2 years older, was a very caring type of girl. She still is. And she used to bring me home. But one day I apparently got impatient and walked home by myself through King's Cross, which was a bohemian area then, a pleasant bohemian area, rather than perhaps the sleaze that one associates with King's Cross at the present time. But having my poor old sister coming home in tears with a policeman, she'd been wandering around King's Cross trying to find her brother. So I can remember that.
Did you get into trouble?
No, I didn't get into trouble, not that I can remember. It was all, I don't know why I actually did. I don't think I was trying to be difficult. I think I just lost her and decided to do what a good horse does and walk home.
What kind of a kid were you?
I suppose a fairly placid child. I was a very keen sportsman, probably good at most sports, which I suppose enabled me to mix quite easily because of that facility with any type of ball games, or boxing was quite in vogue there, so that gave me a certain standing in the local area, and the little groups that used to go around and bully people, I generally avoided all that, which was fortunate.
So you had a sister 2 years older than you. Were there any others?
No, just the two of us.
And when you were living in King's Cross, what sort of house did you live in?
My parents were country people. My dad was a farmer who could do virtually anything with his hands and pull a car apart and put it together again. He's regarded as one of the best mechanics around. But when they came to Sydney, they were determined not to pay rent. I think they'd been drilled in from earliest age from my old Irish grandmother, never pay rent, it's dead money. So my mother, I think, borrowed money, and they were forced really to come to Sydney because of losing property. But when they came to Sydney, they bought a residential, and we survived by having a residential. My mother used to hire out the rooms and pay the landlord every week, and we would virtually live rent-free, but organising letting rooms and cleaning rooms, but generally we got the same tenants for years and years. It was like an extended family.
And did your parents own the building?
No. They had a residential in Surrey Street, and then they bought a residential in Paddington. And places which I think I was teaching in North Queensland at the time. My father had died, and my mother rang up and said she was moving out of the home at Paddington. She was offered that place for £1,300. I think it would be, I suppose, $1 million now. But they were always going to move out and buy a place. But my father died when I was 12, so they never quite did that. But they never had the thought of buying up a place in Paddington. They had the idea that you never buy old places. You buy a heap of trouble if you buy old places. And again, that was part of the family type of folklore. So they knew how hard they were to maintain, so they weren't going to buy them. But in hindsight, of course, it would have been a very wise thing to buy not one, but buy the whole street if you could have.
In King's Cross, and what was the name of the residential?
In King's Cross, it was what was it? I think it was 33 Surrey Street.
Did it have a name?
I can't recall the name. No, I can't recall the name. Possibly most of these places have a little plaque, but we never used the name.
Is it still there?
Oh yes. The bottom part of Surrey Street has been taken over by the freeway, but no, the house that we lived in is still there. I worked when I was in Paddington, I sold papers up and down that street for some time, so I got to know the area even when I was a bit older. It's still very much there. But the street that used to go right down almost to the church there in Rushcutters Bay or St Canis's, that street, all the old houses there have been removed because of the highway. But Surrey Street, our place, is still very much there. It brings everything closer to the cross. You seem to even be closer to the cross than we thought we were.
And what sort of clientele did you have as residents?
We had a variety of people. In the front room there was a couple that they seemed to be quite wealthy. The husband was a wharf labourer, and the father, and they used to have a place at Palm Beach. They go away every week. I think he used to have a catch-it bag. Every time he came home from the waterfront, he'd generally bring home what he caught in the bag. I think he did well out of that. I think there must have been a lot of that went on. What
do you mean, fishing, or do you mean goods?
Oh, goods. I got that impression when I was a youngster. No, I think they eventually bought a house in Brown Street, but they had those lovely front rooms. They'd been there for years, even before we came.
And this is at the place at the cross?
This is the place. My apologies there. Can I just confuse the two places for a moment there? I'll just go back to Surrey Street. The clientele we had there, they were generally Aussie battlers. I can't remember the details of them, but I can remember them being around for a long time. There was a Mrs. Tippett. I remember Mrs. Tippett. She was, and then her sister. There for a while, the one lady upstairs used to have various husbands, as I thought at the time, and somehow she had a change of husbands relatively frequently, and I used to always think the husband, until I got a bit older and realised that they weren't actually husbands, but they were de factos. But that was a part of the life then. No one seemed to be unduly disturbed. It was just the way people lived. So things haven't changed very much.
And your parents didn't mind?
I think my parents were, they had their own high standards, but they were inclined not to judge others. And if people had their own set of values, they didn't interfere with that. No. It didn't seem to unduly worry them.
And they were farmers before they came to the...
My dad was a farmer, yes. He had to leave school when he was 12 years of age. His father went blind. He was the eldest son of a fairly large family. And they had a property, and they used to own a hotel before that, and they went on the land. And my grandfather went blind, or was going blind. And my dad really was, I remember being told by my aunts that he was pulled aside and told, look, John, you just have to leave school, we've got someone to run the farm. And he cried bitterly, and he never refused to do it, but that was one of his great disappointments, that he really never had a very extended formal education. But his skills were in with his hands and, as I said, anything mechanical. But he had all the skills. He had all the skills, like many people, I'm sure, who came from the country, had all the skills, but they had no piece of paper. And he came just in the Depression period, and they had a really rough time. My father, learning, using jackhammers and shaking all night after coming home in bed with the force of the jackhammers. And so it was frustrating for someone who had a lot of ability and felt that he never had the opportunity to use it.
Must have been an enormous change to come from the country and fairly conservative kind of social values that I would associate with the country anyway, to King's Cross, really. Well,
not for my mother. My mother was one might say, had great ability of adapting. She hated the country. She used to tell us that when she was at Geary, halfway between Dubbo and Wellington, and she'd look across the railway line to this little school, and she'd say, my children are never going to go to that school. No. And it was this family joke. My mother would say, look, I fought all my life to come to Sydney, and now I'm here, I'm staying. I mean, I would have loved $1 for every time I heard her say that, At one time, when I was a bit older, Dad had died, and I was away teaching, and my mother said she got a pensioners unit, and I said, Mum, did you take it? Oh, no, dear, I didn't take it. I said, Mum, why didn't you take it? Oh, she said, it was... She said, I set out to have a look at it, but I turned back. I said, well, why, Mum? Well, she said it was out in the sticks. I said, Mum, where was it? She said it was out at Ryde. That was my mother's mentality. She loved the centre of Sydney. She loved to get on a bus or a train. These where any distant suburbs were taboo. So she was extremely adaptable.
So she would have really enjoyed the bohemian sort of lifestyle.
My mother did. I mean, she was very a lady, always the lady. Like when she died, I was going up in the lift when the pensioners unit, and she was in it, and someone mentioned to a group of ladies, and one didn't know. She said, she's the lady. The lady. My mother was always gloves, always the lady. Even though she liked the bohemian side, she couldn't stand the small mentality of the country where everyone knew everyone else's business. That drove my mother mad. So she loved that freedom that the city gave. So across, my mother revelled in that type of area. But as I said, it wasn't a sleazy area. But even then, I mean, my mother would go to the Cross at any time, walk through. She didn't seem to notice that. That didn't worry her. That was part of the scenery.
Well, I understand that in those days, that the brothels and the street girls were really working in brothels rather than being on the street.
That's right.
So, and everyone knew where they were, including the police who raided them was duly appointed times, and that it was less. It's not like it is now.
No, it's not like it. And my mother was, my grandmother was Irish, and they had the penal mentality. A lot of the penal laws of Catholics in Ireland, they regarded as English laws, which they didn't have to obey. I mean, it wasn't any sense of ethics or morality, it was the penal laws. And my mother had that idea about SP booking. I used to, as a kid, run down and take SP booking, and that take the down to the local SP booking. But my mother was back with SPs most of her life, but she had no type of, she wasn't cheating the government, it was just, there were penal laws, and, oh well, there wasn't anything of ethics in it.
And who was the SP bookie?
Around that area? Well, in Darlinghurst, I was slightly young for the Darlinghurst scene. I know Mum used to back on the SPs, but in the neighbouring Paddington area, I'm very clear on that.
Now, who was there?
They were just down the back lane of Glenview Street, and when I'd go down, the police, well, it was common knowledge that the police would tell them there was going to be a raid. And so when you wouldn't go down, or you went down, there was nothing there. There was always a cockatoo in the lane with his wireless sitting there, and just in case some constable happened to stumble upon it.
It'd be operated from somebody's house, wouldn't it?
Oh yes, just the backyard. You'd go into the backyard, and there was a back window, and I'd take the bets in there. Even as a youngster, I used to, sometimes when I'd go down there, I'd hear comments such, if I don't win this, I walk to work. And I'd look around and see two little kids around the fellow. And I used to think, no, even though I was 10, and what about, that's all right for you, mate, what about your kids? So I probably have never put money on a horse. I don't put money in a poker machine even. Probably because of my early influence, all the early influences on me, that I used to feel people were getting ripped off.
Did the bookies must have paid though? They must have operated it as sort of almost a legitimate business, because if they didn't pay up if you won.
Oh, they paid. They paid better than my mother always felt, even when she was just 79, she still used SPs because they gave better odds. Oh yes, it was all. And an SP used to come to my mother when she lived at Waterloo, and he'd go up there and each week, and she'd pay her, or he'd pay her, or Mum would pay him, and she'd have the bets for the locals. Even when she was in the very late 70s, a friend of the family told me that, look, your mother's memory's going, and I said, oh well, I suppose it has to happen. That very day I happened to go to her, and she was ringing up. And as I sat on, just picked up a book, my mum was answering the phone, and I heard, I want $5 on this, all up that, I want Cornella on this, I want... And these horses, names were tumbling out, and I looked around for notes, and there were no notes, and when it finished, I said to my mother, how did you remember all those names? And she looked at me and says, oh, why wouldn't I remember all those names? So I thought, well, there's nothing much wrong with my mother's memory. Sometimes when she got older, I'd ask her, how the investments went. They were always spoken about as investments. And my mother was like a good fisherwoman or a fisherman. I'd be right then for the next half an hour. Mum would give me all the details of what Niddy won and what did win and what should have won and what could have won. But occasionally I might ask that question in the front of, say, a relative, and my mother, I could see my mother being quite guarded. She, in her later life, felt perhaps it wasn't fully ladylike. So I learned not to ask the questions in certain relatives' company. But it was great, like someone like my mother, even for the youngest age, we'd get into a cab. My mother never thought of... money was to go round, And if we were running late for school, I've known my mother to get a hire car to take us to school. We had to be on school on time. Money was to go around. And if I went with my mother in a cab, the conversation, she'd always be in conversation with, she'd get in conversation with the cabbie, but that was a marvellous social lubricant, the common interest in horses. My mother was a prime example of that.
And what about your father? What was he like?
My dad was a solid citizen who was older than my mother. He was my father never raised his hand to me at any time, but he had the ability to be able to control the situation very well.
Right, let's stop.
A person, a lovable man, a gentleman. Things didn't work out. He was in the country where he had to leave school, and then we got going in the country and his farm fell apart, and he worked on the local council and then came to Sydney, and they had their real difficulties, and just when he was getting on top of things, he got cancer, and he suffered greatly for 3 months. He was the type of person, he became a driver for the nuns at St Vincent's Hospital. And he had a great friend who was Mother Giovanni, who was in charge. She was a rectress at that stage. And people had great regard for him as a person. When I met people later on, I remember she spoke to me in glowing terms of the man. But just when he was getting on top of things and saving a bit of money and getting to buy his own home and actually buy a car, and he got cancer and suffered greatly. So, but a tremendous father, someone who was always interested in us, never used it's just people getting belted by their dads and all that. It was just taboo with me. My mother might give me a bang, but my dad, just never. But he just had that ability to say, "Listen, Tobe, that's the end of that." So I was very grateful, even though I lost my dad at 12. His memory, extremely vital.
And how did he find city life and living in the Cross?
Probably he might have wanted to live elsewhere. Like he took Mum out to Mascot to look at buying a place out of there. My mother looked at these places and said, "John, no go. No go. If they're going to buy a house, it would have to be a place, not a little," as my mother would see, a little wooden shack out there underneath the flight path. My mother just wasn't coming at that. So she was a strong woman, and she knew what she wanted. So I say she would have been quite influential in it. It would have been a joint decision. So the woman's lib, I think my mother had that idea well before it may have been popular.
And so when your father worked running the residential?
Oh no, Mum ran the residential. Dad worked at EMCO, a factory, and in that industrial area, just EMCO, I think it's in that industrial Zetland area, and he worked there for a number of years.
What did he do there?
He was the machinist, and then he started to work for St Vincent's Hospital, looking after their cars and driving the ambulance, and then he ended up just virtually driving the nuns all the time, because they had a car but no one drove, so he was mainly their driver.
And were your parents active in the church?
They were traditional type Catholics, and my My dad was, I don't think, active in the church. They were practising Catholics, and the Mass of Sunday and prayer for them was important, and we'd say the family rosary, but...
Every day?
At times, yeah, well, yeah, one period, yes, in my later life, I think, yes, while Dad was alive.
Was it after he got sick?
Oh, no, just prior to getting sick, no. But I don't know if that went on for very long, but periods, we used to say the family rosary. My dad used to hate humbug or hypocrisy, and sometimes he saw things as hypocritical. Yes, he was very down-to-earth sort of fellow.
And what about your mother?
My mother, yes, she had very liberal ideas in many ways for her time. Things like birth control, etc. My mother would have had very liberal ideas. She couldn't understand why people got uptight about many things, even when I was relatively young. But she was very much a Catholic and a very prayerful person, right through her life. She'd never go to bed without spending some considerable time in her own prayers. So she was a prayerful type without being a religious type.
And you went to Mass as a child?
Yes.
And Catholic schools?
Yes, I went to Potts Point as a little fellow. My sister went to Potts Point all the way through.
What was that called?
That was St Vincent's. I think it was St Vincent's College, Potts Point. Then I went to. I was going to go to Marist Brothers at Darlinghurst. They didn't take children until they were about in 5th grade, so I went to the Christian Brothers little school there at the parish school at Darlinghurst. And so I stayed there and then moved on to St Mary's Cathedral.
And what was your school experience like?
I had the influence of some significant people in my life. Yes, particularly, I'd say, yes, I was taught by one man for 4 years, which is rather extraordinary in your secondary school, primary and secondary. So this is the old days when there'd be one teacher per class, even in your secondary, in the lower secondary. So as I went to 5th grade to 6th grade, and then to first form to second form, I had virtually one teacher.
For 4 years?
4 years.
Who was that?
It was a Leo Doolan, who's a Christian brother, a very fine fellow. We're still great mates. He's in Victoria now. He should be retired, but he still presses on.
And what was it like at St Vincent's? How come you started school at the age of 3?
Well, they had a kindergarten, which was part of the school, and my sister was starting at 5, so the idea was that I would go along to the school there, and like people go along to kindergarten. And I remember being extremely upset by when I had to go to school. I mean, I had the idea it would be great until I got to the front gate. I can still remember going in Victoria Street in that back gate. But I managed to survive the first day and the second day. So I started at 3, and at kindergarten.
And did you spend a couple of years in kindergarten?
I think that I probably, in hindsight, suffered. I probably didn't have a learning readiness, using modern jargon.
But
Mum had the best of intentions, and I don't think she realised, and I don't think people gave her very good advice in those days. And as a result, my reading, I had great difficulty in basics until I got to 5th grade, and then this man who had influence just got me to repeat year 5, so I caught up in age with proper age then. But still I had difficulties until right through, until I through secondary, and so I had a lot of leeway to make up. So somehow I've made up, and I got an MA in English and Masters in Education, so I've managed to make up. But for my early childhood, it was in hindsight, it was a wrong move to go to school too young, particularly when there wasn't the facilities around to detect people who fell between the stools and just weren't learning.
What sort of Was politics ever talked about in your...
Oh, yes, yes.
Who would they have voted for?
Oh, we would have been Labor through and through. My dad would have said, you know, you're a Labor person, you vote Labor. And my mum voted Labor till she died.
And were they active in any of the local branches?
No.
Can you remember any political discussions?
Oh, yes, I can. I can remember that politically when the idea of outlawing communism came in. And my dad was very much against outlawing communism. And he adopted the Labor Party view that you drive people under. It's better to have parties out in the open, don't drive them under. And they're very much against Mr Menzies wanting to drive these left-wing socialist, communist, whatever they may, to underground. Yes, I can remember that very strongly.
But do you know if in the Depression years he was part of the unemployed workers movement?
No, he wasn't. I think my dad was so busy getting work anywhere he could, and building sites and just anywhere he could.
What can you remember about the ending of the war? Can you remember that?
I can. I actually can remember being in King's Cross, and the joy that I experienced, that I sensed people had when the announcement came through.
Sorry. Okay.
I think I can remember the exact place where I stood and sense this tremendous relief and joy.
Where was that?
I can visualise the place. It wasn't very far from where they're building the new residential over the overpass at King's Cross. I was near there. Just up, there's a block of flats, just a stone's throw from that area, and I was outside those block of flats when the news broke. I was playing or whatever it was.
And how did the news come to you?
I suppose it came through word of mouth that as a kid I picked up that this dreadful war was over, and you'd be able to buy cars and do all the things, buy footballs and those things which we couldn't have, and Coca-Cola, and have all those things, and fountain pens, and which we could never have, and biros.
Well, what can you remember of the war period then? Mostly deprivation?
Yes, I can. The difficulty of getting a football. My father bought me what did he buy me? He bought me a football cover. He could buy me a football cover, but he couldn't get a football bladder. So he had to get a soccer bladder and put it in a football case. And I was so sad when I saw gradually the football go out of shape and look more like a soccer ball than a football. And then having that type of that was the things that I would have loved to have just weren't available.
And your father never had to go to war?
His eyesight was too bad. Eyesight too bad.
And what was the cross like in the war period? What can you remember?
Again, Sue, it was just a place where people dressed in a rather bright way, that people wore things that they didn't wear anywhere else, that they had long hair sometimes. And
Are you talking about men or women?
oh, well, I'm not sure about the men. I was never surprised at what I saw at the cross. People were different at the cross, and I never felt surprised when I met people who looked different, like wore different clothing, and it was a place where you could go where people were different. So that's what I remember.
And accepted as
part of life, yes. Accepted as part of life.
Can you remember any particular characters who are well known up there?
No, I can't. So I can't at that period. Can't remember any. Well, as I got a bit older, I could remember the lady used to jump into cabs. I was on one occasion. I was being taken from the school down to make a record. I was to have a reasonable voice, and I was going down to make a record there were two. I was in the cathedral choir, and we were going down to make a record as a duet or a solo. I think it was a solo and a duet. And Miles jumped into the cab, and the cab driver said to her, "I am not moving." And she said, "Well, I'm not moving." I said, "Well, I'm not moving." So it was getting nowhere. And she realised that the cab driver knew her only too well, so he wasn't going to move no matter what happened. So she jumped out, and I remember the slamming of the door. I thought the thing was going to fall off. That was my experience of B. Miles.
And was she...
She lived in the Drew. Well, we used to think, I never actually saw her, but we were told she lived in the she had a place in the drains at Rushcutters Bay. It's whether she actually lived there, I'm not sure, but that was the folklore amongst the kids anyhow, that's where she lived.
Were kids afraid of her?
No. Oh, I certainly didn't appreciate the slamming of the door, but if you passed her in the street, and I did pass her in the street from time to time, no. There didn't seem to be, I can't remember any fear associating. I wasn't particularly fond of getting into a cab where she jumped into again, but other than that, no.
Was she dirty, or was...
I can't remember any smell. I can't remember any griminess. She wore rather unladylike clothes, like overcoats, and but I didn't associate her with dirt. When I remember that episode in the cab, no, I can't remember.
So she wasn't a vagrant?
No. We used to look upon her as someone who was... She spoke extremely and with an educated speech. I can remember that in the cab. And folklore, we used to think she had been a university student and came from a wealthy family. I've never read much of her life after that, but that's what I grew up with anyhow, that she was a bright lady who just went cuckoo.
Can you remember anybody else? What about, who are some of the bohemian sort of people?
I remember that, say, the parish priest, Mons Wallace, used to... we always thought that there were people at the cross, like well-known characters up there, and their names escape me at the moment, but they would, from time to time, contact him and want to speak with him. That was our understanding. He used to have associations, and from a pastoral point of view, of people in the cross. But I can't recall any notable characters other than Miles. If a few names were mentioned, yes, I'd probably say, oh, yes, I remember those names. But the fact that I can't recall them would indicate that they weren't very strong in my memory.
Was the Catwoman of Woolloomooloo still around?
Don't remember the Catwoman, no.
Well, before you were talking about who your clientele were in the residential.
Right.
Can you remember? We got distracted on
right,
that.
in Paddington or in Darlinghurst?
Either one.
Right. They were people that... well, when I say Aussie battlers, upstairs on the third floor in St Paddington, we would have had a lady who became very much part of the family, that even when she left, Mum would go and visit her. We had, in Darlinghurst, I remember we had a lady who is still kept in contact with us when she left. She had a nervous breakdown and she was rather odd. But my mother was kept in contact with her. We had in Doreen Anderson. Doreen Anderson was a person that money went through her hands all the time. Her husband was a Norwegian ex-sea officer, and she became very much part of the family. And even when my mother was dying, she was dying too, and otherwise my mother would have gone down to her. The Caseys, who lived in the front room, they were kept to themselves. They were the people that were wharf labourers, or Dad was a wharf labourer, and or the father was a wharf, didn't have any children. They looked very comfortable, and the fact that they could buy their place later on, and they had a place they used to go to each weekend. They'd go away and stay at up the coast somewhere.
But was it was the community family oriented, or was it sort of all different kinds of families, like more of what's typical today in King's Cross? You know, you're talking about couples without children, you're talking about single women, and
there were
what was the social
in King's Cross. There were families with children. Families with children. We play constantly in the street.
Where did most of these kids' parents work?
I don't know. Paddington would be more, if I can talk about Paddington.
Yeah.
Right, well, in Paddington, the locals near me, one was a bookmaker. From, say, the ones that come to mind would have been the Thompsons. The dad would have been a small bookmaker. The Bosdens, they would have had a carrying business or worked in the Waratah taxi trucks. The others would have worked in, been factory people, worked in factories. We didn't have any doctors or lawyers or solicitors. We didn't have any professional people. I don't think any of them, dads or mums, had any type of strong business connections. They generally were the in that time, people who lived in Paddington we had the workers, and they were the workers.
Are we talking now the late 40s?
We're talking about the late 40s. Yes.
Okay.
And the hotels were pretty rough in those days. I mean, going past the hotels on Saturday, fights, etc., were reasonably common. I think people used to escape from their hard life by probably excessive drinking. So Paddington in those days was a rougher area than it is now. And the kids were rougher. You had a group that would imitate the dead-end kids. You know, you would have had those who walked around in gangs and harassed people who were perhaps easily intimidated. So that went on. And in my earlier days, I remember being bailed up and harassed. And I was so grateful at school that we were taught as part of the normal sport. We were taught things like self-defence. And if you develop certain skills in that way and developed a reputation, you avoided all that. So I was very grateful that...
Well, they avoided you.
Well, they wouldn't, yes. They would, yes.
Mm. So who are these dead-end kids? Was that actually the name of the gang?
Oh, name of the dead, yes. You go to the cereals on a Saturday, and one of the cereals was the dead-end kids.
Oh, this at the cinema?
Yes. And groups tended to imitate them.
Oh.
You had the smart guy and the clown, and they would tend to imitate what they saw as the dead-end kids and get around in groups of 10 or 12 and be a menace in some ways to any shrinking violet they may happen to meet.
Mm-mm. Well, who were your friends?
I had kids I went to school with. At that time there was still that religious rivalry between Catholics and Protestants. It was very much present. And your friends tended to be the Catholic kids that you went to school with.
Did you ambush the state school kids on the way home?
No, we didn't. Never that.
Did they ambush you?
No, we didn't. No, I never experienced that. The dead-end type kids would have been the kids from the that weren't part of our scene generally, but that was just coincidence, I think, more than anything else.
Mm.
Yes. But there was a very strong, in Paddington, there was a very strong family family groups, and kids would play constantly. Like cricket used to be every afternoon in the street. So it was very much all football was played in the street. Well, certainly cricket was played in the street very regularly.
It was safe to do that?
It was. Occasionally the car would come along, but you'd stop and let the car go. And the streets weren't all cluttered up with cars because people didn't own cars in Paddington.
So you'd have all the gutter areas?
Yes, yes. And you have the whole street. Like we used to play in Brown Lane and bowl up Brown Lane and hit into Glenview Street, and there didn't seem to be any. Occasionally a car would come along, but it didn't worry us.
What else did you play?
What else did we play besides cricket? Well, the streets were... We used to play marbles for money. I mean, gambling was even amongst the... for example, you'd have your marble and you'd put your money on your marble, and all the marbles would be lined up with the piece of wood, and then let it go. And who marble got to the end would collect the goodies. We'd play football down the park. You wouldn't tend to play football there, but play football down the park.
What park was that?
At Russcutters Bay.
Was that a safe place to play?
Yes. Oh, yes. I mean, we never thought of any problems there at all. And I was fortunate having a dad who would, make things for me, and he would make me a little trolley which I could put behind my bike and ride off to a park with all my stumps and cricket gear, and he would come over with me and bowl me out all the time and teach me never always to go forward to a spinner. Well, yes, I had opportunity that way. And we had Centennial Park. I used to, again, my generosity, my dear old mum, who wouldn't have much money, but if I wanted to go horse riding, I could go and hire a horse in Centennial Park, which I did about every Saturday. And so we were very fortunate, having films, 5 Ways films, every Friday night or Saturday afternoon to get in for 6pence and buy a drink for 3pence.
Would most kids be able to do that? Was that affordable for most kids?
Yeah, Saturday afternoon films were very common. Very common.
Do you think it was a cheap form of childcare? Because they used to show 2 films plus have entertainment.
Yeah, I mean, you could certainly look upon it that way. Yes, 2 feature films. There may have been 2 westerns, pretty harmless type things. And the film, the 5 Ways, was owned by the Hickeys, or run by the Hickeys. He was your local electrician. He's Professor Hickey's dad, who's at St Vincent's Hospital for years, the heart man there. And he ran the local theatre, and he was very conscious about the type of films that were put on. And I think when he saw the writing on the wall and didn't have control, he just sold out. But when we went there, the type of films we put on, he had people of very high ethics who were conscious of trying to make sure that children saw films which weren't going to do them any harm.
Well, what about the horse riding? Could most kids afford that?
Probably not. It's just like someone like my mother who worked most of her life. Even when my dad died, she still continued working and she still ran the residential. We were never really short of money. My mother would borrow money if had to. She used to be a great friend to what she used to call her Jews. She'd go and borrow money from the Jews. They regarded her one of her best clients. She'd always pay them back.
Was that a pawn shop? Or?
Oh yes, those pawn shops, yes. It's where my mother never dealt with banks. She just dealt with the Jews, as she used to call them. And she'd pay them back, probably an exorbitant interest, but she was able to buy Surrey Street virtually with nothing, and then Paddington, it was with virtually nothing.
Why do you say buy it?
When I say buy it, they had to buy the right to be to own to have the what would you say, the franchise, you might say, of the residential. They could sell that. You could sell the franchise. So you had the owner of the property and then the owner of the business. And running a residential was like a business, and they bought into that business.
Be like goodwill and...
Yes, and you'd pay. I can remember very vividly at Rushcoe when we were at Darlinghurst, all this money was all paid in cash, there's no cheques, and they were paying for the residential, and they were paying in cash, which they'd got off the dues, and they paid that, and then they paid the dues each week to pay it off, and then they did the same when they moved from Surrey Street to Brown Street in Paddington. They borrowed the money and paid it off on a weekly basis.
Would these... Were the how she refers to the Jews? Were they really Jewish, or were they?
Yes.
Or they
No,
were just?
no,
that was
Jewish.
just a.
No, they were Jewish.
And did they operate a pawn shop or money
Yes,
lenders?
all the pawn shops virtually in Darlinghurst at that time were owned by the Jews.
So it was. They really were.
Yes, and they were. My mother and Dad always lived in debt. Like when they would come, Dad would come home of a Friday night. First thing, we'd go down and we'd pay the greengrocer, because every time we bought something we'd dock it up on a week, and we'd go down and we'd get our big treat. It was an ice cream, and Dad would pay from his £5 that he got, he would pay the bill for the week. He'd come home, and that kept us going for another week, and we'd pay the dues and they have a little bit of money left over. And my mother sent my sister to Potts Point, which was a very expensive place for them to send to. Now, of course, she would have lived all her life in debt. You buy things and you afford them afterwards if they're really necessary. That was their mentality. You didn't look for security. You looked for things that were really necessary, and somehow you paid them off. And they did.
Do you think that would have come about because of them surviving the Depression?
Oh, yes.
We got through that, we can get through this.
Yeah, my mother had a most positive attitude. Things collapsed around her ears. You know, we were little kids and Dad had died. And, she's going to that funeral, and Mum was concerned that our shoes had to be polished, and there was no weeping and grabbing the kids and wailing. You put your chin out and make sure that you're going to be well dressed and well presented, and no, that was the attitude.
Did you get any assistance and reduction in school fees from the nuns at St Vincent's?
Oh, I think she would have, because the same order that Mother Giovanni, for example, she was charity, and they ran St Vincent's. So I would think that, knowing Mother Giovanni, she wouldn't have asked; she just would have insisted, which probably helped my mother no end. But I remember the parish priest, Mons Wallace, asking my mother, did she... No. She was right, thank you very much. I didn't look for anything. If something was... I wouldn't be surprised if my sister got some aid. I always meant to ask Mum that, and I never got around to ask her. But I would have been surprised if that hadn't come about.
And your fees too, really?
Oh, well, I went to schools where, say, Darlinghurst, we used to pay... £6 a week, I think, and they collected it. It was very poor. I mean, the schools were run on a pittance.
Well, how is it that your sister, normally the boys are given priority in education, so... Well,
my mother had the idea that that she was going to send me to some school but I was probably fairly strong-willed too, and I started at Darlinghurst, and I was quite happy to continue in that vein. I didn't want to go to Waverley College or these places. No. I used to always say, look, Mum, if you go to those places, you've got to be a Don Bradman to get into cricket teams and Clive Churchill to get into footy teams. No thanks. I'm right. I'll go there.
Okay. Well, when you were younger and before your father died, and you were living at the Cross, what did the family do for fun? Like, you've talked about the things that you've done, but did the family as a group, what did they do?
The family as a group at Darlinghurst, when I was at Darlinghurst. Well, I was go to places like the gardens. I remember going down to the gardens. We were that I haven't got strong memories of that.
Did your parents go out together?
No, go out together. No, not a great deal. Not a great deal. I think Mum was running residential. She was often taking jobs, and she'd work on the weekend. And
what do you mean taking jobs?
well, she would when she was young. Well, like the jobs that my mother did over the years, she worked as a cosmetic factories. She worked at cafeteria canteens for schools, boarding schools. She worked in places in town like Coles and these places. We'd have women who would prepare the goods and take them around. And my mother worked a lot, and she didn't seem to have very much free time. Her free time, Saturday was sacrosanct. That was her investment day. And she'd love to go to a live show. Occasionally my mum and dad would go to a live show, occasionally, very occasionally.
What, theatre?
Theatre. She wasn't very keen on the pictures. We would go to the pictures as kids. My sister loved pictures.
So your mum really had two jobs?
Oh yes, my mother had two jobs most of her life.
Even when your father was alive?
Yes. A lot of the time, yes, she did.
It's pretty tough. Did
Well, no more than, say, people today. I mean, if I look around, most housewives now. But Mum was well before her time, where that wasn't common, where it's common today. My mother was an extremely independent lady.
And did she keep her independence from your father?
Oh
in
no,
terms of,
no, it was a family setup.
But she wouldn't have to ask his permission to spend the money.
Oh no.
That's not.
No, I mean it didn't work that way. It was a family money. It wasn't the idea of the husband's money and the wife's money. No.
So if she thought something was necessary, she would have the freedom to buy it.
Oh yes.
Well, would they go up in the evening, given that they're so close to the cross and you had all those cafes and coffee shops? Were there much? Would they go out for coffee or something late?
No. Myself and my sister did. Like when we were even young, we'd go our frequent
what
walk.
age?
I was about 11.
You'd just go for a walk?
Go walk through the cross.
Because the shops were always open.
Always open. That's what Mum loved about it. You could always go to the chemist at any time. The shops were always open.
Yet she didn't go out and enjoy that herself?
Not at night. Oh yes, if Mum wanted to go anywhere to the shop, my mother was often helping somebody else. Like someone was sick or something, my mother would be the one who going to the chemist to make sure that person got the things they needed. And I swear I always associate Mum with always to the rescue of somebody or something. But I can't remember her, other than her investments, I can't remember her going and having entertainment. No, I can't remember that.
And not even going for a walk with your father in the evening or something?
Well, a weekend we'd occasionally go somewhere, especially when we were at Paddington, where my father had the use of the car. I used the car because he drove, and the nuns used to, when they weren't using a car, Dad would have the car, and he would take us all over the place.
Oh, where would you go?
Oh, we'd go to places like Nielsen Park and places like the. I remember the botanical. Well, those gardens. It's an awful. The one out at Oakley, the one out at Lotus, the one out there, the national park there, and the national parks at.
Do you mean the Royal National Park?
Yeah, the Royal National Park. We'd frequently go there. We'd go to places. It was a common, yes, of a Sunday we'd go out and drive and Dad had a big van, or the one that used to pick up people from the hospital, and we'd pop in and go there. So that was a very enjoyable part. When I was about 11, from 10 to 12, that was a very enjoyable period. But when Dad died, of course, that all faded.
And when you were living at the Cross, you said you'd go for walks with your sister. Well, what would you do in a typical evening? I mean, this is pre-television.
The wireless was a very big part of our life. The cereals.
And what were the cereals?
All things like First Light Fraser and those cereals, and Yes What, and Yes What, those cereals. Don't remember those. They were all very much part of our early life. And I can remember when they started to bring on serials about murder, and my mother getting all uptight and saying, we can't listen to that, and we found that very hard to accept, couldn't see anything wrong with it. And she used to probably lose more than one, win the battle. But yeah, the radio was very much part of our life.
And in the summer, would you also wander around the Cross?
Yes, go for a walk around the Cross.
Were there places that you weren't allowed to go?
No, we didn't seem to venture into those places. We just walked through the Cross and
what do you
looked
mean
at
those
life.
places? What are we talking about?
I wasn't even aware of them. I wasn't aware of the brothels.
Oh, but anywhere, like, you know how some, kids are just told they're not allowed to go, not necessarily to the brothels, but how free were you to roam?
I was extremely free, probably freer than most people. I think my poor old mum used to be criticised about ruining children. She had 2 children who were absolutely ruined. They could do what they liked. We had an extraordinary freedom.
And did you know most of the shop owners up on Darlinghurst Road?
No, they were just shopkeepers, and we used to deal from the local people in Paddington, but like the Lewises up the road, the Jewish shopkeepers and the butcher, but no, up the Cross, they were just shopkeepers, and we didn't know them personally.
Oh. Was there a sense of community there, like amongst the people at the Cross?
When we lived there, very much so.
Yet you didn't know the local shopkeepers?
Oh, yes, I did. In Surrey Street I did. Oh, yes.
Oh, right, but not up on Darlinghurst Road?
No.
Can you describe the shops that were in the main thoroughfare there in Darlinghurst Road, say in the late 40s?
Not in any detail, no. The chemist shop that was always open, day and night chemist shop, I can remember that very clearly. I can remember the Chinese restaurant that is still there today. That was very much, I think it's still there, it might have been taken over.
Oh, stop.
That's on the court.
Okay, we're talking about the shops, the type of shops that were in King's Cross in the late 40s.
Yes, in King's Cross. Well, in the King's Cross area, I probably speak more about them in Victoria Road. The ones in Victoria Road, the ones that come to my mind are the all-night chemists, which weren't anywhere else in Australia, or weren't anywhere else that I knew of. They weren't common, but they were very common. And the restaurants, the Chinese restaurants, that you could go up and typical get takeaway food, which we did from time to time. Other than that,
Is this Victoria Street?
This is Victoria Street, yes. I can't remember any great detail other than that, because I moved out of the Cross when I was in that area when I was relatively young. Paddington is certainly
What
much
can you
more.
remember of Paddington?
Well, I
What
can
were the
remember
shops?
Paddington, yes. Just the ordinary,
What street are we talking about?
well, talking about, say, McDonald Street, up, we're talking 5 ways. 5 ways would be one, but more around McDonald Street, just the top of Brown Street. There was the greengrocer that sold virtually everything. there was the fruiterer that sold, in the typical fruiterer, there was the butcher. They were the three main ones. And, you know, you could book up and pay. The battlers would book up and pay at the end of the week, certainly the greengrocer. And they were friendly people. For example, if you wanted a reference, remember we went to Mr. Lewis, who wrote a reference for my sister when she was getting a job. Like, he was very much known and respected. And when he was potted for having a dirty shop, we went up, and I think I was given a few dollars to help him clean it up. Underneath the fridge, I wasn't very pretty, but that didn't seem to unduly worry us.
What was the ethnic mix in the late 40s?
Very much Anglo-Saxon in our area, very much Anglo-Saxon. It was only in St Mary's Cathedral that the ethnics, the malts and the bolts, as we used to call them, excuse the language, but that was the language that we used. Like the Maltese came there. That was the first influx of Europeans. And my family would have been very much Anglo-Saxon. My grandfather was Irish, was English, straight off the boats. My grandmother was from Kerry. The other side, I think they almost go back to the convicts. Very much Australian bushman, horseman. My dad was a drover. So, and on my mother's side, that is her grandmother, my grandmother on my mother's side was straight over. She kept all the Irish brogue until she died, and as a youngster they'd go down to the shop and ask for ins and have people smile at them, and everyone wanted to serve my mother because she had all these Irish expressions from her mother. But when her younger sister married, she married an Italian, and that put a cat amongst the pigeons in our family. And my uncle, who was Jack O'Sullivan's father, Jack O'Sullivan won the Melbourne Cup. They were horsemen from way back, and his son became a famous jockey. But I used to hear my dad and Uncle Pat speaking, and they used to get great enjoyment out of my Uncle Paul, who was the Italian. They would just get tremendous enjoyment out of him. He was so different, and you never showed emotion, and you soldiered on, and you took things, you copped it sweet. But my uncle once had his car taken. He was an Italian, and he was a barber and a very good businessman, and always had a big car because he's only small in stature and always dressed very dapper. Shoes always polished, and his rounded figure. And when he got his car taken outside St Mary's Cathedral, I remember my dad and Uncle Pat just having so much laugh, and they would take him off. And if I catch him, I poke his bloody eyes out, you know. And they would sit back and just roar.
Oh, it's great.
Yes.
But it was a friendly...
Oh, yes, very friendly. And they were the lovable type of Australian who had probably been, my grandpa was a larrikin, but a lovable larrikin. And he could laugh at himself and laugh at others. And I had other uncles who, I remember one uncle who was probably a con man in many ways, and great friend of Mum's, he would come, Uncle Arch was always having deals, and he'd come and he'd have gold one time and some another time, and not that he wasn't a thief, but he would, I'd talk to him sometimes, he'd say, listen son, last night while you were asleep I made thousands. No, he was the type of, always on the verge of making the millions. Always seemed to have a lot more money than we did. But even then, you know, I dare say he didn't make it from a 9-to-5 job, but that was part of my heritage. You beat the system. The system's going to rip you off, and unless you rip it off, that was one element. The other element was a very matter-of-fact, down-to-earth Aussie battlers who knew it tough and had great compassion for other people because they'd had it tough themselves. But could laugh at other cultures and was very much different from theirs, and their reaction to difficulties and blights just to cause great amusement.
So this was your mother's sister who married the Italian?
Yes, yes.
And so your mother's sister lived in Sydney as well?
They came to Sydney. And again, my mother helped them when they came to Sydney, and they had four children. She helped set them up, and they established their own barbering business in the city, and did very well.
And where did they live? What suburb?
Oh, they moved out to Clovelly and built their own home at Clovelly, which was a big time for us, seeing someone actually build their own home from scratch. And then they moved to Brighton Sands and had a very nice home out of Brighton Sands.
Mm. And in your family, did you, where you were living in the residentials, did you sort of have like a flat, like the ground floor flat?
We'd have the, well, not so much, we had part of the ground floor, and then I had my own room, a little room out the back, and my sister had a little room, and Mum and Dad had a room. So there were a lot of rooms in the places. I mean, Paddington was 3 stories, and they were fairly, well, I suppose if I walked there now I'd get claustrophobic, but they were big in my terms. There were a lot of rooms.
Mm. And was it the sort of a place where, like, the place had to be open, or was it like a home where people had keys to get in the front door? Do you know what I mean? Like, did the residents...
the place...
Or was it like a hotel?
I suppose we locked at night, but I can never remember ever having a key. I mean, home, I'd always go home. It was never and I can never remember having a key, except I think later on, we started to lock the back gate. We locked the back gate, but I can never remember having a key to a door, and the back gate key was always nearby.
Was your sort of home where you'd have a lot of family around? Would your aunts and uncles visit a lot? Was there?
Yes, they would visit. Yes. I had a very wealthy aunt who, at that time, who was very generous to us. She used to come with a chauffeur-driven car, and she married in a very wealthy family. And she lost all the money trying to hang on to it. When her husband died tragically, she tried to hang on to huge properties, and the government took them over. And how she had her ups and downs. And now she's in an old people's home, and I visit her regularly. She's 93. But she was the generous one of the family. If we got something wrong, like I had lost the use of my hearing in one ear, and she was the one who just would come along, take me straight into Macquarie Street. No referrals, paying guineas, I just go straight in. So she was a great backstop.
So, and there would have virtually always been somebody at home, really, with all your tenants and people coming and going.
Oh yes, there's always someone at home. And the tenants, like some of the tenants would pop in at any time. It was a very much a family-orientated, extended family in many ways. And lady upstairs, I'd pop in, and if Mum was away, I'd pop in and into there, a little, just open house, more or less. It was a very extended family. Like, they weren't tenants, they were part of the extended family in most cases.
It sounds like that you would have had a very sort of broad sort of upbringing, really.
I was very fortunate and a very broad upbringing, yes.
Because you had a lot of influences.
Yes, I had a lot of influences over those years. See, things like my mother always told me if I was out somewhere and I was having difficulty in a bus, get a cab. And when you come home, just knock on the door and get the money and pay. I remember horrifying people by the fact that I was coming home from a Scouts Club at Paddington and there was no buses, but I was getting a bit concerned, so I hopped in a cab, and the cab driver had somebody else, so he took me all around Clovelly and Coogee, and eventually I came back, and then he gave me 22 bob just for the company. And things, and wasn't unduly disturbed by that. I mean, that was, and when people thought a kid of 11 jumping into a cab at 9 o'clock at night. But so I had a freedom about me, which I was very grateful.
Mm.
I don't know if I had my own children, I probably wouldn't be as free.
Mm.
No, I'd probably put more structures.
Mm. It didn't do you any harm.
No, I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about the impact of the Americans on life at the Cross with the war and the R&R. Can you remember anything about that or changes that you might remember? I know you were very young.
No, I can just remember the Americans as being charming people as a kid. They were so friendly when you'd meet them. I mean, one memory that comes to my mind, I was with my mother. When I say she would take me, we were out at Manly, and I got a ride on a Dodge cars. And as I came in, full of the exuberance of being in this Dodge car, my mother had another ticket there for me. And it turned out that the American soldier had been there, and he gave money to my mother, just asking her, would she mind, can you give you another boy a ride, because I'm getting so much pleasure out of just watching him. Because his own lad probably would have been back home, and he was associating me with his own kid. So I remember that friendliness and of making, and I had no fear of the Americans. They were the good guys in my youth, you know? And they were charming. That's the type of people that I met. They were generous, charming type of fellows. So I associated the Americans with the good guys.
Hmm. And with them, can you remember them in the Cross, or the impact of that sort of influx of...
I can remember the clean-cut American soldiers moving around, yes. And I can remember associate them with handing out chewing gum, which we never saw. I can remember them, yes. I associated them with the goodies and generosity.
And can you remember what the attitude was of your family to them?
Oh, very friendly, yes. Yes, I didn't get any anti-Americanism when I was a kid. I didn't get any.
Mm.
I remember I can still remember the American Army police going around.
What were they like?
All seemed like giants to me. Seemed like giants, but I never saw them roughing anyone up.
How did the war affect your family?
My dad felt very much the pressure to go to war, and he certainly joined up, or tried to join up. I associated the war with the loss of the favourite son of the family, my Uncle Lawrence, who was a lovely singing voice, just a gentle one that everyone loved. And he went away to the war. He went away to the war as an ambulance driver, and came back with the result of the war or not, but he slowly died in Uralla with tremendous pain, a very virulent form of cancer. So
where did he go? Where was he stationed?
No, I don't know. He was overseas as an ambulance driver. Now, that was a tremendous impact on the family, because he was the youngest of a large family, and he was the type of guy that would never speak ill of anyone. Like, if he went into town, like, this is part of the folklore. Everyone knew Uncle Lawrence when he was young. If he went into and found out that someone had divorced or someone had gone amok, and he'd come back to the farm, and the girls would all want to know what happened, and they'd find out 3 weeks later, and they'd go to Lawrence, and his answer was, "I didn't think you would be interested." That was the type of person that he was. Apparently a charmer, and he was the one who, was loved. My grandmother had a big influence on me. She was about 90 when she died. That's my dad's mum, and she lived with us for a time at Paddington. She lived with us a time. Now, so the loss of Lawrence on her was quite profound. So I associate with the war with death and tragedy.
Mm. And what was the feeling when it was over? What, you know how you said you can remember when it was...
I can remember tremendous relief, tremendous joy and relief. This sensation, I was too young, how I would have been 5, I suppose. But I can remember that joy of the war being over.
So you, even as a 5-year-old, sort of had some sense of the dread of what was going on?
Yes. I can remember being lifted anyhow. I can remember being lifted.
By who?
Just the people around me.
Picked you up?
Yes. Well, then I just picked up and...
were you listening to the war reports on the radio a lot and all that stuff?
No. I was too young for that.
Were
But
your
I did...
parents?
Oh, yes, they would have been. Very much so. But no, my remembrance of is just sensing, the little puppy in the family when there's tension and all that being lifted.
Mm. Can you remember when the Japanese bombed the ferry in the harbour?
I can't separate the stories from the reality. But it was so, I remember the details of how they came through the net, and I knew all the details. But I knew those type of details. But I think it was probably just from hearsay. Mm. But I can remember the dreadful fear that when I go to the films and the Japanese army would come into a village and those clicking of those shoes, and every time I saw a Japanese, the fear would come. The real fear. The same with the Germans, the German helmets. That would, even when I was a bit older, and you'd see these propaganda films, well, they were propaganda films, but the fear that the sight of a Japanese would engender in me. Mm. I can understand people who went through it, but even my fear of the Japanese, and even today, I don't trust the Japanese. Just a matter of when something's going to happen. I still have that. I mean, underneath the surface, it's still there. There's a distrust of the Japanese.
Mm. God, I lost the question. Can you remember much about air raid sirens and blackouts and all that kind of thing?
I can remember the air raid shelters. I remember the air raid shelters built in backyards. And some still kept them for a while after the war. And I remember going to some air raid shelters and just, they used to use them as type of cubby houses and things, but I can never remember having to go on formal drill, but I can remember air raid shelters.
Mm. Going, say, back to your family life, one question I want to ask was, what was a typical meal?
The typical meal would have been like my dad every morning when he went to work, he would get up. My mother wasn't an early riser. She would work all hours of the night. She never rose early. She never got up to get my father's breakfast. That wasn't just on. Dad would be up, and if I was serving mass or up early, I'd have breakfast with him, which was always eggs and bacon or some meat. We always had a cooked breakfast, a real farmer's breakfast. And he'd never cornflakes and eggs and bacon, a toast and tea. Always an egg for breakfast in some form or another. Now, at the other meals would have been just a very Australian type food. Corned beef and cabbage and stews and tripe and steak, and my dad used to always have a little bit of the highest quality, no junk. Like if they bought steak, it was always a rump steak. So they had a very sense of good quality food, but we'd never have things like soft drinks or ice creams. That was a party occasion. When I went out to my rich aunts and we'd go to a fridge, and you'd be a fridge, not an ice chest, like we always had ice chest, but a fridge. And inside the fridge you'd actually have soft drink that you didn't go up to the local store on a special occasion and buy soft drinks. So we would have had good, simple food. Great change when I go out to my aunt's, and of course she had an Italian husband. She's a very good cook herself, so she learnt to cook Italian style. And to have Italian food was such a variety, and spaghetti, as we used to call it, spaghetti. I love spaghetti. When I went to boarding school, we had spaghetti. I thought, you marvellous spaghetti. And then the first time I realised there's spaghetti and there's spaghetti. And I didn't like the spaghetti. Yeah, so I had variety that way. And I experienced, when I go to my rich aunts, I'd experience a different type of style of life. And if I went to my other aunt, I'd get a cultural mix. But in our home, it was very Australian, straight up and down. My mother was never noted as a great cook. My dad used to cook on a Saturday. He'd have his few steak and kidney pie was his specialty. Great, but they're the type of food we'd have. And dessert, big thing was canned peaches and cream. That was a big deal.
And did you have dessert at every main meal?
Oh no, that would be a Sunday fare. That would be a Sunday fare.
And did your parents like the Italian food?
Oh yes. Yes. My mother never tried to imitate her sister and cook it.
Yeah. I was going to ask who were your neighbours. A lot of the questions we've sort of covered. Well,
who were our neighbours? Well, we had some unusual neighbours. We had Paddington, a lady who used to scream most of the day, just literally scream. And no one could do anything about it. And she'd rave and rant. She went through a breakdown, I think, of menopause, and she raved and screamed every day of her life against a poor old lady who lived, Mrs. Waters, who lived next to her. We were in 73, Mrs. Waters was in 75, and she was in 77. And she screamed and she yelled. And we used to hear this.
Was it abusive?
Oh, yes. It was just part of the atmosphere. And the police didn't seem to be able to do anything about it. Eventually, about 4 years later, she was finally taken off to a lunatic asylum, as we called it. But I grew up with this lady screaming and yelling practically every day of my life.
Okay.
When I say scream, I mean absolutely scream.
Blood-curdling?
Blood-curdling scream. Scream top of the voice. And she was just a mad lady who lived up the street.
And who else was in the neighbourhood?
Well, my dad was more a sense of propriety than my mum. Like the lady who had left her husband and was living with a fellow up the street who got very friendly with Mum coming down. Dad used to get a little bit uneasy about that. Didn't worry, Mum. But I think in the long run, Dad's used to feel, well, I think Mum probably just for peace didn't encourage the different style of life as much as she probably would have. I mean, she never encouraged it, but it didn't worry Mum. So we used to have a variety of neighbours. Mum would speak to all of them. When she walked down the street going to work, she would be waving both sides of the street, talking to that one, talking to that one. She used to enjoy the company of people, and she regarded them as friends and neighbours.
So it sounds like there was quite a strong sense of community
There
there.
was a strong sense of community, yes, strong sense of community.
Could you expect people to come? Well, when your father died, for example, did you get support from the neighbours?
Oh yes, strong support from the neighbours.
How did your mother afford the funeral?
Again, this is where my rich aunt came in. And when I was burying Mum last year, that I had to get permission off my aunt for Mum to be buried in the same plot as Dad, because she still owned the plot. And she didn't worry her at all, but I had to remember going along to her, and she paid the entire funeral.
For your father?
Yes. Yes, entire funeral. And that's why Mum had saved all her life, put money into, she thought she had, dear soul, put money into an organisation when she was, from then on, paid off £2 a week or something. And when she died, I went to it. There was so little in it, but she thought she'd paid off a funeral a couple of times over. But
she'd been fleeced.
Oh, well, nothing had come. The amount of money she paid would have been much more in inflation terms than ever she got back. I went to the little book and I'd see £2 this week, £2 that week. Sometimes she'd really try hard and put £4 in. Remember what £4 would have been? And when she got back, she got pittance. But she'd somehow saved with a pension and her investments. There was still money in her investment account at the tab. She'd become righteous and gone to the tab by that stage. There was money to pay for a funeral many times, at least well and truly a funeral. So although she thought she'd paid for a funeral another way, she actually had paid for it by just having hard cash.
Gosh. Well, when your father died, getting back to that, what was the response from the neighbourhood? Well, you were living in Paddington at that time.
Living in Paddington, yes.
And what was the response from the neighbours?
I think very supportive. That's my mother ran the residential for years after that, by herself. And she got, running a residential, 3-storey residential, the constant maintenance of it. And she'd pay neighbours who were handy people to do this and do that, and she wouldn't have been able to do that without a lot of support.
Okay. Getting, say, first of all, King's Cross, what would you say was the main social focus of the area?
Can you be a little bit more specific, Sue?
Was there a place where people met? Was there, like a pub or a house or just sort of something that was where people from the neighbourhood, if they were going to relax a bit, might get together?
The pub for the men was very significant.
Which pub was that?
In Paddington or in Darlinghurst?
Both.
Well, the Green Park Hotel was very much a watering hole around about that area.
Is that Paddington?
No, that's in both, really.
Oh, right.
The
Okay.
Green Park Hotel. In Paddington, the big centres that I associated with hotels were up in Paddington Street, around that area. That's where people would tend to. There were a lot of little hotels in that area. The other big social thing was a film, like Five Ways in Paddington. People would go there for their social entertainment. At the Cross, you had numerous little theatres around the Cross. Well, not so much little theatres. They're all gone now, but there was theatres in Victoria Street. There were theatres behind Victoria Street. So going to was important as a social gathering.
Going to it?
Going to the theatre, going to the pictures, as we call them, going to the pictures.
And would it be like that the adults went on the evenings, like,
Yes,
and
adults would go.
And kids would go on the
Go on a
day?
Saturday afternoon.
But kids wouldn't go on Saturday nights as well?
Well, adolescents would, from about 12 up. Yes, they would go of a night time, and See, I used to sell papers in holiday time anyhow. I wouldn't be allowed me doing school time, but I would get type of money at least during holiday time. So I always associate the hotels with the men. Now with the women, I don't associate any particular place except dropping into each other and having cups of tea. That always, when you went to someone's place, the cup of tea would be on, and smoking was very common. People would have their cup of tea and have a smoke and talk and gossip. As dropping in on one another for the women was a very significant part of their social life, I would think.
Before you just mentioned that you sold papers in the holidays, were you expected to have a bit of a job?
No, not in my family. No, but I think I had the Prussian mentality that we'd had no money to in the backyard, and like when I came home from boarding school, I immediately worked in the I worked in the post office, and then I worked as a telegram boy after the Christmas. So I had that mentality that, well, righto, you had to pull your weight.
What smells can you remember? What smells do you associate with King's Cross?
I've developed a very strong sense of smell, so I thought if there were any smells in those days, I would associate with them. Well, I can remember the bakery. There was a bakery in Surrey Street, just where the highway is now. It's been taken over by the highway. Now that was a very significant smell in my life. I remember in Paddington, we used to have a tobacco factory just up from us in McDonald Street. That used to belch out tobacco's stench. Well, it wasn't, we didn't regard it as a stench. It was a strong, pleasant tobacco smell. And we used to go past and see all the tobacco being cut up. So they're the two ones that I remember. Yes, and you asked me about social life. If I could my big social life as a growing up was playing tennis. And myself and my sister, again it was generosity by dear my mum, from the time I was about 11, I used to play tennis practically every afternoon. In Paddington, for example, there was a court. You'd go up there and put a shilling in the slot. It was all honour. And you go down and play tennis. It was an ant-bed type tennis court.
Where's that?
Where the big flats are now, in just down from Glenmore Road. There were three courts. There were two courts, and we played every afternoon. And when we got a bit of money, or again my parents were very generous, I'd go down and play at Rushcutters Bay. The tennis courts that are there. And I was coached down there at Jensen's tennis coaching. Then I'd travel on a weekend to Narwee and all these places, and myself and my sister used to play in mixed competition. So that was very much quite a part of my life. And that probably, I think, kept me out of so much mischief, because I was, if I wasn't playing tennis, I would be practising on the back wall, or having practice swinging my golf in the backyard, or throwing a golf ball against the wall and practising my cricket strokes. So that kept me very much occupied.
Well, with other kids in the neighbourhood, I mean, what were the sort of things that other kids did that you know of?
Well, that's where I think that they missed out. That when we played cricket, etc., I think a lot of them found time hanging on their hands. And when I was about 11 or 12, I was fortunately caught up in a different area where I didn't stay in the area of the weekend. I would be off playing tennis according to the competition. We'd have our home team. Our home team was in Newtown, and I'd play the home team. I'd play on Saturday morning I'd play competition. Our home team there was at Narwee. It was given my influence of my mum. You wouldn't stay around alone. I'd go to Narwee to play tennis. That was my home team, and then we'd go around to all the areas around that area to play. And on Saturday afternoon I'd be playing, being coached again in that area. On Sunday morning I'd be playing men's competition when I was 12 in the local area. I used to play B1, where our home team was at Newtown. Then Sunday afternoon I'd probably be playing social somewhere. So I didn't get much time to get in mischief. Mind you, the studies didn't get much of a bang either.
But what about other kids in the neighbourhood? What were well, you know how you said they had time on their hands. Well, were some of your friends in that situation, and what were the consequences of that?
I used to think they got very bored. I used to feel that even as a youngster that people seemed to get very bored. They didn't have very much to do. So I grew away from the local scene when I was about 12, about 11.
And prior to that, can you remember sort of having any adventures with your friends when you were playing around the back lanes?
Ah,
and
yes,
things like
yes.
that?
A big adventure was the Scottish Hospital, which was a virgin forest, a huge virgin forest. It's only recently I walked down there when I had some surgery at St Vincent and what was the hospital? The Scottish Hospital. The Scottish Hospital had this untapped virgin forest. It was just a forest. And a big fence with barbed wire. Well, how many kids always got in? And we used to climb trees and wander through this forest. It was an adventure land. We played in there frequently. You have these trees, these old trees with great big long limbs, and you'd work out along these limbs and climb up. So that was having that forest there, a huge forest, untapped forest, where my bedroom was right opposite, and the kookaburras in the morning and the flying foxes would all be there. This is in Paddington. It's still there. I mean, the grounds are still there, but they've civilised it. They've got pathways through it now, and they've built actually down, but they've still kept the atmosphere of the trees. But you just wander through huge, and no one ever touched it. Just a forest.
And did the administration, they just ignore the presence of the kids?
Yeah, they would ignore it. I remember being great umbrage when they had a tennis court in the middle of it for the staff, and no one used it much. And I went on with my sister and put a bit of rope up and was playing tennis. And the matron came down and called us vagabonds. I mean, I was furious. How dare they? I mean, this was our playing field. I mean, I wasn't doing any harm. No one was using it. We called those nasty names. I was when we going home so annoyed. My dignity had been affronted.
And what else did you do with your friends?
Oh, I did the usual, going down and smoking when I was about 9 in the Scottish Hospital, and taking cigarettes off my dad until he found out, and waited a week until we had visitors, and just as they were handing out cigarettes, he said, "Look, Tobus has taken up smoking, perhaps he would like one." And being so embarrassed, I think that was the last time I ever had a cigarette. Very subtle, he was a very subtle man. And I was easily embarrassed, and he knew I would be easily embarrassed, and he played it to the hilt. And we just go down and play locally at the Russcutters Bay, and play usual football down there. But I was fortunate as much as, always being a fairly good sportsman, I got into representative teams from school very early on. And if I wasn't playing, I'd get myself organised. For example, I used to play in the East Sydney rugby, the Australian rules team, because we didn't have junior rugby league teams at that stage, so I'd go down and play Australian rules. That means I'd practice twice a week and play on Saturday morning. So I was
if I wasn't playing for the school, I'd be playing organised in the local competition. Or I'd be playing organised tennis. So that tended to be my life, wrapped around. I couldn't stand going down and mucking around, playing scrap football. If I was going to play a game of football, it was going to be a game of football. I didn't particularly like going down, mucking around, hitting a cricket ball around the local oval. I wanted an atmosphere. I wanted people in their whites. I wanted a pitch that had a mat on it at least, and a new ball. And if I was playing tennis, I wanted the tennis court to be nicely rolled and watered, and an atmosphere and someone scoring.
Sounds very proper. Must have got it from your mother.
Yes, I wanted a great sense of competition. When I was in a boxing ring, it was going to be never walk back, no matter what happens. So I had a strong sense of, I had a very competitive spirit. Probably undesirably so, but it kept me occupied.
Well, what about your association with your teachers at the school? I mean, how is it that you ended up at Christian Brothers? You must have had some...
Oh yes, I think Leo Doolan would have been very much an influence in my life, yes. So someone who had great respect for the kids. I remember speaking to Dr. Marnie recently, who's the kidney specialist over at Royal North Shore, and he's got his kids going to Riverview, and he's just amazed how one man... We were at St Mary's at 72, 73 in first form, and he would teach us virtually all day.
What, in one class? 72, 73 kids in one class?
In every subject, virtually every subject. And, you know, people did remarkably well, and he was saying his kids go to Riverview, and they have specialised classes for this and specialised classes for that, and he wonders if they get much more out of it than they got out of it. If you were bright, like he was, John Marnie, you'd do well anywhere. But probably the battle is, I mean, you didn't always get good teachers, but if you got a really good teacher can teach in a barn. It's the rapport that they build up, and I think even modern research shows you've got to get down to about 8, 9, 10 students before you get individual tensions in a class. A class is a class. And if you've got a good spirit in a class of 72, surprising what you can get done. But it's the spirit in the class. And I was fortunate to go to a very friendly school, and I had really significant people taught me. And when I went to the Juvenated when I was about...
The what?
It was a type of school that you went to for, if you were thinking of being a Christian brother. I was there at a very early age. I think I was just turning 15. And I was fortunate having extremely good teachers, and of course it was highly sports orientated, which suited me no end. So, and I was pulled out of being an academic mess, I suppose, by going there and having very skillful teachers and very close teachers who would really correct your work and make sure that you got it back and would do something about it. So I was fortunate that way. So what I missed out on my early education, I picked up. So my mother, for example, I'd never get my leaving certificate. Never.
That's what your mother thought?
Oh, Mum thought I'd never get my leaving certificate. I couldn't read when I was 13, so no, never get a leaving certificate.
And was there pressure on you actually to sort of get your act together from at home, or did they just accept that you perhaps weren't as bright as they'd hoped or something?
Well, they recognised I had other talents. I mean, I could sing, I could perform in concerts, I was probably much better than average sportsman. I had fairly good social graces. But as regards academic ability, no, I'd probably miss the bus. But they felt whatever I do, I'd work it out, and I would have worked it out. I'd probably been a good butcher, or I would have worked it out.
But they had a lot of confidence in you.
Yes, my mum had a lot of confidence. She felt somehow I'd make it. I mean, I mightn't get my leaving certificate, but somehow I'd make it.
I've asked about places you weren't allowed to go. Were there any people that you had to avoid, that you were told, look, you've got to keep away from them?
Not that I can remember. No, I didn't have any boo-boos. There were some people I didn't have to be told to keep away from, but
Well, who did you keep away from?
or the mad lady up the street.
Oh, yeah. We've talked a bit about friends. Like, do you want to name who your friends were? Like who your friends were?
When I was a youngster.
Yes.
Well, I remember the Bostons, I remember the Tomos. It's awful, because I left home at a fairly early age. I would have been 14, I suppose, when I left home. So, and when I went to school at St Mary's, because St Mary's had kids coming from everywhere, my friends spread.
Right.
And that's the reason I started to play tennis at places up the line at places like Narwee and East Hills, because that's where a lot of my school friends came from.
Did many other kids from the Cross go to the St Mary's?
St Mary's never got a great number from anywhere in particular. They'd get them from everywhere. When I was teaching there, I taught there for about 6 years. I think there were something like 100 parishes represented, some extraordinary number of parishes, extraordinary number of nationalities. And that's what made it a tremendous social mix and an ethnic mix. They came from, you get a number of them, the Lebanese element from Redfern, and then you get the...
Were they there when you were there?
They were just coming. They were just coming when I was there. When I was about in year 7, they were coming to year 4 and 5.
St Mary's charges quite high fees, isn't it? I thought it was a sort of a GPS type school.
No.
Not like Riverview.
Oh, no. So that's what they call a systemic school.
Oh, right.
People can't, well, the rhetoric, and I hope they still obey it, is that people can't afford, they want to go to school and they can't afford, they don't pay anything. There would have been a lot in my time who wouldn't have paid anything. And yes, I've known families who've sent their whole kids through without paying anything. What they try to do, so St Mary's, if to ease the load, that if people can pay, there are some people who, their priorities, they may have 2 houses and 3 cars, but they can't afford fees, because that's why they see things. Well, that's difficult. When I've been as principal in that situation, it's very difficult to try to say, well, look, the fee is fair. Other people who really can't afford it, and they're finding the money somewhere, so I've got to insist that you just try to pay something. So it's a balance in justice, and yet there's a real danger that, unless we're careful, that things that Christian Brothers have fought out their existence for, that we look after the battlers. The danger is that the kids who really need help, and we're not touching, and that's a real danger, and I don't know the answer to it. But there's a danger that the really poor are not coming to our schools. Not that they couldn't, but I mean, there's a human pride. They feel they're going to come begging. They're not going to come.
Or not even understand that they could get that relief.
Right. That's a danger. That's why we have some men running schools for kids who just can't fit into any other school. Like Bidwell, got school out there, kids who just can't fit into any other school. But it takes a certain skill, tremendous skill, to deal with those type of kids. I mean, I'm responsible at the moment for running the computer section of a SKATE program, Street Kids Access Tertiary Education, run by the nursing faculty at the University of Technology. That can be extremely tough work. Sometimes you're really spitting into the wind. But you may get 13 who finish up out of 35. And that can be, at times you feel, well, what are you doing? But there are 13 that wouldn't have finished otherwise. You can't have a success mentality, because you feel a failure every time you deal with them in many cases. But they're the kids that, that's a danger. Everyone knows that. Anyone knows that. And see, when I was here, I was taught here for years at Burwood. Now, The, 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 the danger is that you run good schools, they look good, and they should be good. They should be really good schools. But how to run really good schools and at the same time look after the kids that no one really wants, there's a challenge.
Thanks very much for talking to me. Is there anything else that you wanted to say? Or any questions I haven't asked that I should have asked, or that you thought were important that I've missed?
No, Sue, no. Our conversation has been long-ranging or wide-ranging. I hope not too rambling.
Oh, that's great. Okay, thank you. It's too personal. Do you think it's too personal and not enough history? I could be attacked for this. You know, it depends on what your view. See, but I'm sort of cutting people that were adolescent. I'm sort of cutting. I want them younger, like 8 is a good.
Right.
8 through.
Right.
That's okay. No, I think the age range, but so maybe we've done about 28 or 29. I'm supposed to be having January.